All right, hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike McShane coming at you live from the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Happy to be with you today. I'm here to talk about a new book that just came out yesterday with Harvard Education Press, Teacher Quality 2.0, Towards a New Era in Education Reform, that I co-edited with my partner in crime, Rick Hess, here at AEI. We're also lucky to have three of the authors that contributed chapters to this volume. I'll introduce them in a moment. Happy to have them here. I wanted to let you all know, depending on how you heard about this, there are lots of ways to participate in today's conversation. So there is a Twitter hashtag, which when I explain to you verbally will make no sense, but if you follow AEI Education or me, on Twitter, you've seen it tweeted many times, but it is hashtag TQ, the letters TQ, the number 2, the letters PT, and then the number 0. So it's TQ 2.0 in the most convoluted way we could possibly think about it. So if you have questions, please feel free to tweet them to that hashtag. There's also those of you that are watching from the Google Plus page. There is a question feature on there. Please feel free to put questions there, and those will get sent to me. You can also tweet questions to me directly. I have my trusty phone here, which, by the way, is still supporting Team USA, always in our hearts. You can feel free to tweet questions to me, too. So lots of ways for you to participate. We're going to talk for a little bit, but then really want to open up the conversation to everybody that's following along today. It's one of the great things about these Google Hangouts. So to give just like the very quick overview of the sort of TQ 2.0 project, something that Rick and I have been following for several years now is these sort of two big overarching trends that we've seen in sort of education policy in the last decade or so. One of which is what we kind of roughly would call the teacher quality agenda. So there have been big pushes for reforms to teacher preparation, to teacher evaluation, compensation, all of these, all of those reforms that have been big parts of the race to the top and Obama administration policy, state level policy all across the country. And at the same time, we've seen this big, interesting, cool development of innovative school models all across the country, be those the rocket ship schools out in California that leverage technology in new and different ways, to innovatively staffed schools that use teams of teachers or others who basically are rethinking how we deliver education, how we manage our teacher workforce. And Rick and I think had some concerns that perhaps sometimes these two forces are at odds with one another. That occasionally when the teacher quality agenda is a little bit too strong in how it defines the role of a teacher or how schools look or those particular expectations, that it could risk stifling some of this really cool, new, innovative stuff that's happening out in the world. So we got together some fantastic folks to look at this question from a variety of different angles. We had people who sort of went in and looked at some of these innovative school models. So Brian and Emily Hassel from Public Impact looked at these kind of innovative staffing models, schools that are leveraging technology and others to really increase student achievement in exciting ways. Bob Moranto and Dennis Beck of the University of Arkansas did a really cool chapter about online schools and some of the policy hurdles that they have to face in order to operate. Bethany Gross and Mike DeArmond from SERPI up at the University of Washington did a really cool chapter about these kind of mission-oriented, both charter and traditional public schools, and some of the hurdles that they get in getting the staff and leaders that they need. And we also had this really cool set of chapters. Oh, and Billy, who's here, which is outstanding, and she'll be talking about her chapter, so I don't want to steal her thunder, but all this really cool stuff going on around new innovative teacher education models, which I won't steal any more than that because it's really cool, cool stuff. And then we also talked about some of the structures that are out there, elements of the system that can sometimes muddy the water. So we have the great Catherine Strunk here from out at USC. She did a really, really interesting paper examining collective bargaining agreements using a cool sample, which again I don't want to get. I could do this whole thing, but I won't. I'll let her talk about her chapter. We had Matt DiCarlo of the Albert Shanker Institute do a really cool paper about a really cool chapter on value-added models and sort of where they can be used effectively and where they run into some problems sometimes. We had Jonathan Plucker of the University of Connecticut kind of do an international look at innovation around the world, which was great. And then we closed out with Dan Goldhaber, who is also joining us, with I maintained probably at least 20 or 30 dissertations pre-baked that someone could show up with tomorrow in graduate school. Unbelievably interesting, useful research questions. And we also use sort of as a frame, Andy Rotherham and Sarah Mead and Rachel Brown of Bellwether Education Partners did this really cool kind of historical look, a paper they called The Hangover, to look at some of the unintended consequences of teacher evaluation policy. And John Maida and Steve Tellis of Harvard and Johns Hopkins, respectively, did a really cool paper about teacher professionalism and sort of evolving definitions of teachers. So as you can see, we did a lot. It was like drinking from a fire hose trying to edit this book, because so many great ideas from so many different perspectives. So I highly recommend you give it a read. Check it out. It's available at your friendly local online retailer. But that's probably enough of me talking about this. What I'd like to do is turn over to our authors here to take a couple minutes and describe the work that they did, some of the implications that they drew from it. So, Catherine, I think if you would be so kind as to give it a start, talk about what you did in your chapter, what you found, and what it means for the audience at home.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And I want to reiterate that it's great to be here. This is my first Google Hangout experience, so I'm enjoying it. I did a paper looking at the collective bargaining agreements, or CBAs, that are negotiated between teachers' unions and school district administrators, and how those might impact the kind of innovative ideas that Mike had talked about. So in particular, the chapter looked at two of the kind of innovations that are happening right now in school reform, one being technology-driven instruction, so things like flipped classroom, rocket ship, things like that, and the second being the new multiple measure evaluation systems that are being used to hold teachers accountable and also to support teachers as they learn how to become more effective teachers. I labeled my chapter the perils and possibilities in terms of the role of CBAs in the implementation of ed reforms, because CBAs, as they currently are structured, hold many provisions that actually could really constrain districts and schools from implementing these reforms in ways that we think would help them be helpful and efficacious. But there are also some possibilities for where we could go from here with collective bargaining agreements that are both already within CBAs and that are ideas for what we could do in the future with CBAs that would really help school districts and teachers to utilize these innovations in ways that help kids to learn better. So I'll go over some of those right now. I'm going to keep it pretty brief, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go forward. So the first question is kind of why do we think CBAs would actually do anything to impact how we implement school reform? For people who aren't sort of wonky about education policy, you might not think about them being that important unless you've read the paper in the last 2 years, and then you start to realize that unions and CBAs actually have a lot to do with how schools and districts operate. So for instance, CBAs dictate policies in almost every facet of school and district operations and workplace. They dictate how the school day and the year are scheduled. They dictate how teachers are compensated, evaluated, the kinds of supports they can be given, how teachers are assigned to their classrooms and how they can transfer between classrooms, the kinds of class sizes that can be used in schools, preparation time, collaboration time, the kinds of grievance structures. All these things are dictated by the CBAs and can really affect the implementation of these kinds of school reforms. So we think about sort of technology and next generation school reforms and school models. These are basically school models that include the use of technology in the classroom or hybrid and online classrooms. And this really changes how teachers in schools operate. So teachers may shift their role from in front of the classroom lecturer and facilitator to more of a coach and a guide. It could change how class sizes are structured and how classes are structured in general in terms of just the location of them, the way that school days and years are scheduled. Similarly, these new teacher-level accountability systems, these multiple measure teacher evaluation systems, are going to change how schools and teachers function. So they expand observations and evaluation, they've enhanced PD opportunities, and they've changed how we think about compensation and promotion of teachers. So I use a sample of contracts collected from California school districts. There are about 506 California CBAs that were governing district operations in 2008-9. I only look at school districts with 4 or more schools because some of the items in contracts really matter most for larger or medium-sized school districts. And I code all of the individual regulations within the contract. And for today, I'll focus on CBA provisions that deal with things that I think should particularly matter for these two particular innovations that we've been talking about. So schedule and hours, class size, evaluation, compensation, and assignments, transfers, and vacancies of teachers. And in brief, what I kind of show in the chapter is that CBAs, as they're currently structured, can really stall reform implementation. So, for instance, things that we would think are totally not that important. So, 63% of contracts in California specify the amount of time teachers can work a day. 42% specify the length of the school day and specific instructional minutes. 92% of contracts specify the number of work days per year. These things seem like just standard sort of how we structure our schools today. But if we have a flipped classroom or we have a hybrid level school in which basically kids are kind of learning at their own pace and teachers are really walking around the room trying to facilitate learning instead of kind of being at the front of the classroom, it might change how we think about the time teachers spend, right? Are they spending time online at night and not so much during the day? Are they spending, how do we constitute instructional minutes if we're not talking about in front of the classroom lecturing, but we're talking about answering kids' questions over email? And similarly, for evaluation systems, these systems might require that teachers take extra time for professional development if something has been found to be wanting in their practice. That might not be part of the typical school day or school year, but might be necessary for their own development that we would want them to be able to pursue in order to become more effective teachers. Class sizes are another issue that really might affect technology-driven reform. So, for instance, what do we think about a class size of 22 in California, which is a very typical sort of arbitrary number that's defined by the state as a good class size for K through 3? Does that make sense anymore if we've got these flipped classroom ideas? Do we still need one teacher every 22 kids, or do we want something different? Evaluation, these are kind of a little bit more obvious, but 47% of CBAs in California don't allow the use of specific factors in teacher evaluations. Almost no contracts allow for test scores to be used in evaluations. Obviously, this is a big issue when we think about the implementation of multiple measure evaluation systems that require things like value-added measures, observations of teacher practice that happen both inside and outside the classroom. So there are elements of kind of every part of a contract that really could constrain how principals and superintendents and teachers can implement these kind of new and somewhat exciting reforms. That being said, CBAs can also provide space for innovation. So contracts as they are today already have space within them that can really help these innovations to succeed. For instance, every year or 2 or 3 years, most contracts allow for the contract to be reopened and kind of renegotiated on certain topics between the union and the district. And so if this new reform came in, it could be that you could reopen the contract and allow for those items to be renegotiated. Some contracts allow or encourage site-based decision-making, or what's called interest-based bargaining, which is really the element of trying to put student learning first. And if that's the way that the contract is really being executed in a district, there's a lot of potential for the teachers union and the teachers to work closely with the superintendent and district and school administrators to allow for these reforms to really shape and take place. That being said, those are kind of the minority provisions in current contracts, because contracts, by definition, were created to make sure that teachers are protected and their working conditions are protected in ways that they've felt threatened before. And so they are intentionally there to limit the discretion of administrators in some ways. And so what we need to do now is think about what is a 2.0 version of a contract, and how can we do this in a way that doesn't just set a new set of regulations and parameters for this particular set of reforms that are then going to be blown out of the water in 10 years when we see further innovation. How can we create contracts now that allow for districts and unions to work together to be flexible in how they implement reforms, and to be flexible in experimenting with ways to improve student achievement and close student achievement gaps. And so in the chapter, I argue that the real challenge in the future will be to simplify contracts, make them shorter or less dense, and basically try to allow them to put more of a guiding principle into place. So the idea that we're trying to make sure that we're protecting teachers and helping them to have a good working condition and good workplace so that they can put student learning first, and to really focus on student learning and closing the achievement gap in order to improve student achievement, and also to be able to implement these kind of innovative reforms. So I'll stop there, and I'll answer any questions as they come in after.
No, totally. No, that's great. And I think you highlighted a really important point that exists throughout the sort of book, but particularly in your 3 chapters, which is also, we do spend a lot of time in the book talking about this sort of 2.0 vision, new and different schools, but in no way is that a statement that we got 1.0 all right, or that everything is working where it is. So striking that balance to say, look, there's still a lot of work to be done that can improve these collective bargaining agreements for schools as currently constituted. and with the sort of current slate of reforms, that there's definitely work that needs to be done there, in addition to sort of creating this space for new things. And I think we see that in Billy's chapter, talking about teacher preparation. We see that in Dan's chapter too, a lot about that we still have lots of unanswered, sort of what we might call 1.0 questions. So thank you so much. So Billy, I think I might kick it to you next and talk. I realize I didn't introduce Catherine because I figure everybody knows who she is. But no, so Catherine, associate professor of education policy at the University of Southern California in the Rossiter School of Education. So now we'll have Billy Gassick, who has a unique position to write about this topic because she is the director of research at a very innovative graduate school of education, the Relay Graduate School of Education in New York. So if you want to take a couple minutes, talk about your chapter, talk about what you found and what the implications might be.
Excellent, Mike. Thank you. So in my chapter, I look at teacher preparation and how some forms of it have sought to meet and address what are emerging needs among our students in this country. So we understand that teacher preparation has been critiqued, I would say rightfully so, and there are several programs that have sought to break from the field and try to better meet the needs of what is a growing number of teachers who are very new to the profession. So we understand generally in the political climate that we are in is that there had been a preoccupation with the idea of a highly qualified teacher, right? Focusing on being able to use proxies who would become a good teacher. Rightfully so, we've moved away from that preoccupation and now we're focused on performance. So we're looking at what are highly effective teachers. How can we predict that entrance to the profession will be highly effective? And so teacher preparation has been identified as a place where that filtering should be done. That's the training ground, the place in which people who are going to be new to this profession are able to learn the skills that they'll need to be successful and to have their students be successful. Many of the certification exams, a good example of this is EdTPA, are consistent with that vision, that in order to be a teacher, in order to be a credentialed teacher in many states, you have to demonstrate that you can pass the EdTPA, which has elements in planning, instruction, and assessment. So moving away from this idea that all it takes is to demonstrate that you're knowledgeable, at minimum, about the subjects that you're going to be teaching, but now moving a step ahead and saying, prove it to us, demonstrate, provide some evidence of your effectiveness in the classroom. And so this chapter looks at the small, but I'm happy to say growing set of teacher preparation programs that are both housed within traditional higher education and also who are independent and on their own. And what characterizes this community of teacher prep 2.0? And so a couple of the characteristics that I describe are as follows. Intentional design. There is clearly some consensus about what good teaching is and how we can get educators to exemplify excellent teaching in their classrooms. But these programs are very explicit about their particular take on the preparation of teachers. So their selection of what to teach teachers in terms of the core general pedagogy to the pedagogical content knowledge, all of that has been explicitly selected by faculty to be consistent with a shared vision of what effective teaching looks like. There's also a common language around what are the best adult teaching techniques that can be applied to help educators improve. So you see lots of programs doing a mix of lecture, classroom style work, in clinically field experience, and you also see a large group being able to take advantage of improvements in technology to leverage some online learning. But these are not decisions made in haste. They are made intentionally to, in total, create a program that will most expediently and successfully raise the bar for the graduates. This leads me to the next characteristic that I described, which is accountability. These programs hold themselves accountable and also hold their graduates accountable. So an example of this, I will use Relay, which is the institution in which I currently sit. An example for us is that in order to earn the master's degree, you have to demonstrate, a teacher has to demonstrate that they have led their K through 12 students to at least a year's growth in academics in a year's time. We are not the only institution that has some measure, some benchmark for the kind of growth that that their graduates are expected to have. So that's the accountability that programs have their graduates to their students to, but is modeled and mirrored by the accountability that they hold themselves to. So many of these programs are engaged in external evaluations. Many of these evaluations have been made possible grants and other funding streams, but these programs are committed to understanding the extent to which their theories of change are held up by the empirical evidence. The next characteristic is something that I've briefly mentioned. This idea of clinical practice. We know that to be an effective educator, as in many fields, it takes a lot of practice, and so it's practice that is embedded in as contextualized and real of an environment as possible. And so many of these programs are doing what just makes sense. So is giving opportunities with students in a classroom in a very structured and supported way. It's not sink or swim. That doesn't anyone. But it's for students to apply what they're learning in the classroom and then bringing the experience of the classroom back into the lecture hall so they can understand and unpack practice. The last element that I emphasize in the chapter is technology. So there are a diversity of online experiences and ways in which K-12 technology either exclusively or as a complement. And so many of these programs understand that in order to help teachers learn how to teach with technology, teachers first have to learn how to learn with technology. And so you see this play out in various ways. I conclude the chapter asking a set of questions for higher education because as innovative as these models are, we have been able to find examples of these proliferating in what would be seen as very traditional higher environments. So not only independent institutions and programs like Relay or the Boston Teacher Residency, but programs that are embedded within schools of education, such as iTeach Arizona. So it raises several questions for institutions who want to be able to do this. One is teaching an academic or professional pursuit? I think that there's an unfair stigma placed on professional education, at least how we think about it in education. But we can think more carefully and seriously and responsibly about how to best structure professional experiences for professional practice. The second is that building a program like this means that you need to recruit talent that may be different and be derived from different sources than typical academic talent. So there's a real emphasis on being able to recruit faculty who have clinical experiences, demonstrate expertise in school settings. This is a very different, this can be very different than the traditional academic profile of higher ed faculty. And then the third is that this flexibility, this curricular flexibility, it does not, must be earned from my perspective. And so in exchange for this flexibility must be or should be a level of accountability for these programs, which depending on what we're talking about, some academic institutions may not be ready for that or may not have the appetite for that. But in order for us to really understand and take full advantage of what these programs are doing, there must be embedded opportunities to learn from their successes as well as their failures.
Great. Thanks so much. Rounding out the crew today, we have someone who I think if I read every one of your job titles, we would run out the time of the rest of this Google Hangout. But Dan Goldhaber, who we were so excited to have contribute to this chapter, talking about sort of Teacher Research 2.0, because so much of his research formed the foundation for what we would call the sort of 1.0 era teacher quality reform. So the fact that he was able to give a forward look at some of these things was just a real pleasure to have. And so for those of you who don't know, I had to write it on my handy sticky note here: Director of the Center for Education Data and Research, Professor at the University of Washington, and the Director for the National Center for CALDR, the National Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education at the American Institute for Research. So Dan, if you could talk about your chapter, what you found, and its implications.
Well, first off, I'd say it's a pleasure to be here, and Mike, I can often not remember exactly what CALDR stands for, so no worries. So my chapter is basically trying to look forward and think about a research agenda associated with what we've been calling 2.0 teacher quality reforms, and I basically break the chapter into kind of 4 sections. One is thinking about what is the leftover agenda associated with the 1.0 teacher reforms. Secondly, a set of research questions around some of the kinds of tools that teachers might have, digital targeting tools, which I'm thinking of in terms of the assessments that teachers might have at hand about the individual needs that their students would have, and also digital engagement tools, which would be tools to try and get students more engaged in the educational process. And then connected with those 2 tools, you can envision a number of novel school designs that have already begun to emerge, but I think we could envision sort of even more innovation going forward. And then lastly, connected to some of what Catherine was talking about earlier, is sort of the way that all of these things might interact with institutional structures and the labor market. So I'll just throw out a couple of the kinds of questions connected to these issues. First, I don't think that we should kid ourselves in that there are a lot of unanswered questions, to my mind at least, connected to the 1.0 policy reforms. So, connected to Race to the Top, we've seen, this at least evolution in the way teacher evaluation is conducted, and I think that we need to understand what are the behavioral responses to teacher evaluation. So, do we see, for instance, if teachers are classified differently than they would have been under kind of an old system where everybody is rated as satisfactory, that teachers respond by seeking out high quality professional development? Does that change the effectiveness of professional development? Do we see that when a teacher's job is made less secure, that affects the pipeline of people going into the teaching profession? Do we see that the evaluations are actually connected to student learning, measured in a variety of ways, such that that hopefully, to the degree that it's necessary, really ineffective teachers are either exited or encouraged because they might find that teaching is not a good fit, to leave the profession, and that we end up keeping really effective teachers in the profession longer than they would have otherwise stayed. So I just would emphasize that this 1.0 research agenda is still very much open. In terms of the digital targeting and engagement tools, I think that we need to sort of, as a first order question, understand whether these tools are in fact being used. So outside of the sort of very innovative kind of schools that we see, the rocket ships of the world, my take is that there's some evidence that there's a resistance to adaptation of technology, and school systems that have invested good sums of money in trying to make technological tools available to teachers don't find much take-up in terms of the use of those tools. So I think we need to understand, are the tools being used, and under what conditions are the tools being used. Also, if you think about these tools, ultimately, they should allow for a good deal of pedagogical adaptation. So we want to make sure that teachers are not just sort of standing up in front of a classroom that they have that might be differently composed in terms of the kinds of students that are in the classroom, and doing the same old thing that they typically would have done in the absence of having digital tools available to them. So I think there's a whole class of questions around pedagogical adaptation. Also, to the degree that we see novel school designs proliferate, they raise a number of really interesting questions around what is the unit of responsibility, how do accountability policies work when you've got teachers working presumably more closely in teams and not sort of responsible for self-contained classrooms. So all the kinds of accountability and governance structures that we think about today, we'll need to rethink those a little bit and see how they work when teachers hopefully are using tools to work more collaboratively. And then I would just come back in closing to some of the issues that Catherine raised in looking at collective bargaining, and say, I guess I would classify myself as a little bit of a skeptic about whether or not, the ability for technology to revolutionize teaching is really going to play out, because I see the potential, but I also think that we have interest groups and governance structures in place today that may limit the extent to which we actually see the capacity of technology to really affect student learning. And so I'm thinking about issues like rural school districts and the possibility that they could share a physics teacher, when it might have been really difficult for each school district to recruit their own high-quality physics teacher. In theory, just like we're hanging out here on Google, we should see that school districts might be able to work in much more innovative ways. Well, collective bargaining agreements are really not set up for that kind of a sharing of teacher labor, nor are they set up for the Boeing engineer to come in and teach a class at high school part-time because they are interested in contributing to student achievement, and they don't want to have a sort of a full career change, but they want to be part of the education system. So I think that there are a whole host of questions that are connected to governance structures, the labor market, teacher specialization, and how specialization might be rewarded in the teacher labor market that will need to be addressed.
That's outstanding. Thank you. I think you hit on something that was going to be my sort of first question to Catherine. And you offer in your chapter, and you just now talk about all these ways in which collective bargaining agreements could be used and how space could be created. And I wonder, just sort of as a person who knows a lot about these, like, what's your confidence that that districts or the collective bargaining units would actually would take people up on that, or versus seeing pushback to it?
That's a great question. I am, I think, less of a cynic than Dan, so I like to try to be optimistic about these things. I do work in a large urban school district, and I study a lot of large urban district issues, and I think my confidence isn't high in the near term, simply because the level of distrust and the level of sort of antagonism that plagues a lot of these union-district relationships is so deep at this point. And I think that to do this kind of next generation contract, you really have to start from scratch and try to build a version of trust. But I don't know how one would do that given where these relationships are starting off. And I think it would be a complete sea change. I mean, you'd have to basically scratch the contract where it is now and start over and say, like, let's really build this from a point of view where we trust that the district is not going to try to take advantage of teachers, and we trust that the union is not going to try to take advantage of the district, and we're going to start with putting student achievement first. And I just don't know how we get there from where we are today without some serious intervention. But I don't know that the way to do it is by just mandating from the federal and state levels that we need to do these reforms and make it work, because I don't think I think we've been doing that for the last multiple years, and I don't think that we've seen those changes occurring to the degree that we would like them to. And kind of back to Dan's point, it makes it seem more and more far-fetched that the reforms that we're mandating from the top down can work if we don't build some grassroots support for them.
Sure, no, that makes a lot of sense. On kind of a somewhat related note, Dan, when we're talking about trying to conduct some of this research, so on one level, just trying to round out the 1.0 questions that you had that Catherine was touching on just there, are these reforms working, and is it a top-down, a grassroots, how that's working? As a young researcher myself, oftentimes I think one of the big questions that young researchers have when they want to get into try and answer these things is money and data. So getting access to the data to answer these questions, getting the research funds that are available. I know you touched on that in your chapter, so your sort of advice to young researchers as a totally biased participant in this conversation here about gaining access to that data or the funding to do this kind of research.
Well, that's a big question. I think I would actually put the data first, because it seems to me that if you have access to the right kinds of data and make a compelling case that you can use the data to answer questions, then the money hopefully is there, hopefully for all of us, Mike. So on the data, and I thank you for raising this issue. I guess my message is to sort of policymakers and practitioners that they need to be thinking forwardly about the kinds of data that they can and should be collecting to assess what at this point would be unproven programs. And that requires really being thoughtful about one's theory of action, about how technology, for instance, put into a classroom or a school would affect ultimately student learning. And so what are the steps that connect the implementation of some sort of technological innovation ultimately to student learning? And oftentimes I think that theory of action is not well developed. And I think to some extent we've seen that with the 1.0 reforms, that we're going to simply redo teacher evaluations and magically student achievement's going to go up, but there's really different ways that could work. And I think that there are different ways that technology could ultimately impact teaching and student learning, and we need to thoughtfully think about what those are and make sure that we're collecting data that allows you to assess the sort of different steps along the path.
Yeah, totally.
Can I jump in there for a second?
Please.
So one thing I think is also really important, I completely agree with Dan, is also kind of a direction that IES has started to head, which is partnering with districts. So for researchers, I would say there's got to be a lot of trust also between the district and the researchers, that the researchers aren't just there to collect the data and ask super cool questions with interesting data and then not help the district in a kind of formative way or help the state in a formative way. And so I think districts acknowledge and states acknowledge they have a lot of open questions, but they don't want to work with a researcher who's just going to like try to do a gotcha headline on a cool paper and throw it away. So I think trying to understand what the district wants to know and how you can help them is a very important part of this kind of next generation of research that has to happen.
Yeah, and I just to play, can I just play off Catherine's point?
Please.
That often requires being in at the front end. That both this issue of thinking about the theory of action and also thinking about the data, one needs to be able to sit down with the people who are charged with making this, whatever the this is, happen, to really think through, okay, how are we going to be able to get convincing estimates of whether or not this is working, and if it's not working, what steps might one take to lead to better outcomes? And again, playing off Catherine's point about the gotcha, try and make it not so much a high stakes, it works or it doesn't, but if it's not working, how might it be adapted so that it can be made to work better?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely outstanding. And you could just imagine so many of these new starting up organizations that are hungry to try and figure out whether what they're doing is working or not. And lots of possible
Yep.
sort of collaborative
Yep.
potential that's there. So now, Billy, I want to pose a question to you that's kind of similar to the one that I posed to Catherine, which is, so right now you mentioned a small, but I believe in your words, happily growing number of these new institutions that are preparing teachers. The future, I would be interested to hear your thoughts about, are we going to see more relays? Is this something that is a very slow growth, takes a long period of time, an exposure to it, leveraging technology, etc.? Can they grow to extremely large size? I was wondering if you could maybe look to the future of teacher preparation, these sort of innovative models.
We've already seen what was new and groundbreaking for relay 4.0 is so I think that 0.0 is where it's at. There are few excuses left for teacher preparation programs and teacher education programs who refuse to respond and react to the needs in their community. I think that in addition to how research needs to be grounded with a partner, teacher preparation needs to do the same thing. And so I think most fundamentally, these new and innovative programs have understood that they are serving a specific community, and so see themselves in service to that community, and then hold themselves to improving the extent to which they can do that work well. I think that model is very easy to replicate. We're not talking about scaling up one mega model and this is the model of teacher preparation. But what we're looking to demonstrate, and I think each of these programs is demonstrating, is that you have a very clear and responsible understanding of the needs of your local community. You can very quickly and effectively design and execute and implement a program where you are putting great people in those classrooms.
That's great. That's great. So one thing that I would sort of ask to all three of you across the various domains that you said here, and I think, Catherine, you touched on this here, is we spent a lot of time today and in the book talking about sort of policy changes that need to take place in order for things to happen. But also in the book, and I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about today, is that also just a more kind of broad cultural change that needs to exist in order to kind of foster these nascent organizations to get the human capital that they need, the regulatory freedom. I mean, how do you see, you've talked about the sort of evolution of talking about trust versus whatever. What are some steps that people could take to help foster that trust so that this space could be created in collective bargaining agreements or just the sort of broader policy space for these schools and teachers?
That's a great question, and it's not something that I'm an expert on. So there's, books by Tony Bright and others about trust in schools and trust in districts, and I would rather throw it to them about the kind of things we know about trust. The only thing I can say from working closely with states and school districts is that it's really important to bring, and I think I've learned this a lot in the last few years watching these kind of reforms unfold, it's really important to bring stakeholders in from the beginning and try to make sure that they are, even if not quite on board yet, that they are aware of what's going on, that they're kind of there every step of the way, and to really listen to the feedback and treat it as real as opposed to perfunctory. So I think that that's kind of the only way that I can think of moving forward. This is gonna work, and that might come down to trying to explicitly address some of the issues where distrust has arisen in the past and fix them. And I think that in the contract in the CBA kind of world, you know, a lot of this fighting has to do with money, right? And we've been in a recession for years, and we've cut teachers' pay. We haven't given them raises and given them furlough days and things like that. And to address the fact that these are real needs. They're not just selfish requests from teachers and teachers unions. And even though districts may not be able to meet them where they want to be, being very transparent about why that is, and I think being very transparent from the very beginning of all these discussions is going to be really important as we move forward.
Great. And so, Billy, I guess maybe the more fair, I put Catherine on the spot there. So perhaps the more fair way to phrase the question, like when you're looking at you sort of lament in the beginning of your chapter and today some of the sort of shortcomings of current teacher preparation programs. And I guess maybe the question would be, is it more of a policy problem or is it a culture problem? Because if it's a policy problem, we can talk about ways to do that. But I think part of what Relay is doing is trying to change the culture of teacher preparation.
Absolutely. I think that we hold our students, many of our core partners are known for holding their students to very high expectations and making no excuses for academic performance, and schools' responsibility and teachers' responsibility to drive that performance. We see ourselves, and I think that the collection of these new types of teacher preparation programs want to raise expectations about what an effective practitioner can look like at the beginning of their career and throughout their career. I think that we've gotten a bit lazy or complacent, sort of accepting that the learning curve for teachers is steep, and these programs are looking to say it doesn't have to be that way. We can be very purposeful and smart about how we spend our time with these educators at different stages in their careers to get them better from day one.
That's great. So I want to kind of kick it over. We're starting to get a lot of questions coming in. Thank you so much for those of you participating at home that are tweeting questions at us or putting them on the Facebook page. I'm gonna shut up and allow you guys to start asking them. So the first question that I have that I think is really probably for Catherine. The question is, in the case of teacher contracts and collective bargaining agreements, were any right-to-work states examined with states that have a strong union presence? So I know your initial sample was California, but I guess my question would be, would you imagine seeing the same things in right-to-work states, or are there differences between the two? I know you've studied these all over the country.
I have not.
You haven't? Okay. I was inflating your resume. I apologize.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Dan has studied them in Washington. There's a set of researchers from Florida that have studied the Florida contracts. So that's kind of probably the most prevalent example here. You know, I think that we should expect there to be variation across contracts in states with different kind of legal regulations about the contracts, about the right of unions to negotiate on behalf of all their teachers. There hasn't been a lot of work done other than the NCTQ TR3 database that really looks at contracts across states. And so I think it's a really wide open research question that should be addressed. I think Dan and I would both advocate heavily for anyone who wants to start collecting these contracts, or in the case of states where they're not allowed to have negotiated bargaining agreements that represent all teachers, there are still association agreements in place in most districts. It'd be great to look at those in more detailed format and understand what the differences are. And one of the things that we hear a lot is, well, it can't be the fault of the contracts or the unions, because in states in which unions aren't allowed to negotiate, we still see poor student achievement. And I think that's kind of a false argument. I don't think that we can create causation from that kind of examination on the cursory details. And so I do think that it'd be great to have someone do a little bit of a deeper dive into other states and understand what's going on there.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
Can I just say this is a little bit playing off your question about culture.
Yeah.
So I agree completely with Catherine that we need a lot more cross-state and cross-district research to sort of assess how what's the connection between certain provisions being in a contract and what actually goes on in the school system. But there's a little bit of research, and actually I believe it's Rick Hess, and I can't remember who his conspirator was on this, that looks at places, both places that have collective bargaining and sort of says it doesn't look like they've really people exercise the discretion that they have within a collective bargaining agreement, and work that looks across different states to see whether, for instance, right-to-work states have different pay structures than non-right-to-work states. And there are differences around the margin, but they aren't huge. So that doesn't by no means suggest that the collective bargaining agreement does not matter, but it suggests that some of why we see what we see in terms of workforce practices might have simply to do with the sort of the prevalent culture out there and the idea that it's sort of safe to do what everybody else is doing.
Great. And one technological note that I will add, for those of you watching, this video will be archived on YouTube afterwards, and because of this incredible Google technology, these questions will actually have a timestamp in the video. So there'll be a little marker when people ask questions and when people answer. So this was posed by Sheena Friend. So Sheena, you can go on there, and I think it may even have your name, and it'll say, this was Sheena's question, and then here were the answers. We're living in the future. That's what's happening right now. Okay, so the next question that was posed by our wonderful viewers, this is for Catherine Strunk, but I think we can send it across the board as well. You weren't going to make it through this without getting this question. So it is, what do you make of the Vergara versus California decision? Does this open up more opportunities for teacher quality reform in other states with similar laws on the books?
Okay, so those are two different questions. I think the second one is easy to answer in that, look at New York, right? So we're seeing the same kind of lawsuit being brought in a state with similar-ish provisions in the state level requirements. So I think, yes, it opens up a lot. We don't have it should be out there, right, that this is what we have in Vergara right now is a preliminary ruling. So we are still waiting for the final ruling from the judge, and that will be much more instructive to us about what we think is going to happen in California going forward, as well as in other states. So that's an aside. In terms of the Vergara ruling, I've come out pretty clearly that I think the Vergara ruling was a good ruling that's going to help schools to operate, if it is held up in what I'm sure will be appealed. It's going to help teachers and schools and districts manage their personnel in a way that may be more efficient. And I think it will help a lot of good teachers and just in the long run and students to achieve better. That being said, it's not enough, right? So you can take away some of the restrictions at the state level around due process, around tenure and promotion and layoff. But at the end of the day, what's really going to matter is kind of what Dan was talking about, is this culture shift. Districts could go back in and they could renegotiate at the district level in California the same exact provisions that were there at the state level, unless it's explicitly said that they can't, in which case they can negotiate something very similar, right? So we want the culture shift to happen. To take away the state level restrictions is important, but it's not going to be enough. That's kind of the long and short of it.
And Dan, do you see it similarly different? How do you come down on that?
I basically see it the way Catherine sees it. The only thing that I would add is that I think that that the Vergara ruling has changed just sort of the conversation that is going on around the issues that were raised in the Vergara case. And that change in conversation is hopefully important for a variety of reasons, including rethinking, well, for a variety of reasons that are cultural, that we ought to be thinking about these issues, about the way that school systems are managed and the rules governing the teacher labor market.
Great. So a question from Twitter for Billy. Billy, the question was, how does Relay effectively measure student achievement for its teachers? I assume it's the teachers that graduate from the program. And that question is particularly for non-math and English language arts.
Mm-hmm. So we have, from an institutional perspective, it's not only on the measurement, but on the identification for teachers within their classrooms of what the learning goals are. So we have what we call an SGA pathway, a student growth and achievement process, where teachers over the course of their 2 years are led and taught how to set goals for their students that are aligned with learning standards, how to take advantage of either tests that their school has decided, or the tests that are going to be administered, or the tests that the teacher themselves administers. Use those as data points to be able to understand their students' progress towards those goals. So our focus, we talk about the end goal a lot, being able to measure whether or not students have met their goals. But for us, that's the tip of the iceberg. What we really emphasize here is that teachers as professionals must have the mindset that they are backwards planning and holding themselves and their students accountable to very specific learning goals over the course of the year. We want to be able to do that so that teachers leave relay with that as part of their practice. It's not just something that they've done to get through this program and get their master's degree, but it's something that work that they orient themselves to, no matter what they're teaching, what grade it is, whether or not there's a state exam associated with it, but that they themselves are able to create a learning environment where those standards are in place.
That's wonderful. Great. So, another question is that in this conversation we've been having, we've been talking a lot about these sort of innovative school models and these new using technology or new staffing or whatever. And one question might be just generally and maybe a quick hit from each of you about your own sort of thoughts about the promise that these models hold to improve student achievement. Do you think that they have the opportunity? Some people have written about technology or these models, having the ability to revolutionize the way we educate kids. Is it something that we could see for a small subset of students, but would be something that would be very effective for them? Would be good. Basically, this idea of kind of this new innovative school model, is this a fad? Is this something that's actually going to happen and change the way that we educate kids? I don't know which one wants that one first. Dan, maybe if you want to go. Yeah, you buying or selling?
Well, if we're just talking about the promise,
yes.
and we're sort of ignoring the impediments to get there, then I am optimistic that the technology really could change the educational experience in really productive ways, but that ultimately it will do that because it will change the human capital in the teacher workforce, or the way that the human beings in the workforce are used. So I don't think that we're going to have robots replace teachers and that's going to be the change. That it's going to be that we use people in more productive ways because we find ways that there's a kind of a better fit between their individual talents and what they are charged to do in the school system, or that we're able to draw different people into the educational process. So I think that there is a lot of promise, and I think ultimately the promise comes from the changes in people as opposed to the technology itself.
Sure, outstanding. Catherine, I saw you nodding throughout that. You are already a self-professed optimist. Does your optimism carry over to this as well?
It does when you think about those reforms happening in conjunction with other reforms that we're talking about, right? And so I agree with Dan that this is a lot about, we know that teachers are the most important and leaders are the most important parts of the school system. And so putting in another technology there is just putting on another layer of possibility for using those people in a better way. I think what makes me an optimist is that conversation and these technological advances are happening and these experiments are being run at the same time as we're having conversations about how to attract and retain and promote and utilize better teachers and improve teachers so they become better in these different venues over the course of their careers. And so if we can compensate teachers differently, if we can thinking outside the box about getting these Boeing, that Dan referenced, these Boeing engineers into the classroom, if we can think about how to fairly do that for different kinds of personnel, then I think that these new kind of innovations in technology have a real potential to completely shift how we reach that kid in the rural district, or how we reach that kid in Africa, or how we reach the kid who needs to work 2 jobs and can't go to school during typical hours, right? If we don't change the structures that currently exist in our school system, then I am optimistic about the concept, but I don't think that it's realistically going to happen.
Oh, absolutely. Billy, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think that, so our experience has been from the higher ed perspective that having technology available to us has allowed us to reprioritize how we spend in-person time. So I think it yields much creativity about why we so often privilege sin. What are the goals there? So it helps us be more critical about instructional time. On the K-12 end of things, I think that the most promise I see there is as supplement. So I think about all the students who don't have access to that enrichment in their daily lives or in their family lives, and so technology gives them access to a space and a community that may not otherwise be open to them. The idea of an extended day and more time on task learning being challenged, I think that's the place where technology is going to make the biggest difference.
Great. Well, you know what, friends? I think that's a great. I like ending on an optimistic note. That we talked a lot about impediments that are there, and they are well documented in Teacher Quality 2.0. Again, available at your local online retailer. But there ultimately are some really great possibilities that are out there. So I would definitely like to thank the three of you for joining me today. I'd like to thank all of you that are watching at home or are watching it in the future. Again, on the same sort of AEI page, and we'll tweet it out and everything. This video will be made available on YouTube so that you can watch it whenever you would like to. Tell your friends. Everybody can check it out. So thanks so much, everybody.
Mike,
oh, yeah.
You're forgetting to tell people about the Teacher Quality 2.0 movie that's coming out.
Yes. Yeah. Is that starring you?
Yeah. No. I think I'm played by like Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt.
That's what it is. Yeah. That's what I thought. So wait, because either one of them is playing me and one of them is playing you, and I can never remember whether you've got Brad Pitt or I've got Brad Pitt. I'm not sure. Yeah. But anyway, thanks you all so much for joining us. Check out the book, check out all the stuff that's online based on it, and have a fantastic afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.